Greetings. My name is Ray Boomhower. I'm the author of Richard Tregaskis, Reporting Under Fire from Guadalcanal to Vietnam. And today we'll be learning more about his career as a World War II correspondent. The manuscript came into the offices of the International News Service in New York without fanfare in early November 1942. It made quite a journey. The pages had been transported from fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii via airmail from a young INS reporter, Richard Tregaskis. For the previous 2 months, Tregaskis had been in the Southwest Pacific on a little-known island in the Solomons named Guadalcanal. He had landed on the island with the approximately 11,000 men of the 1st Marine Division who stormed the beaches there on August 7, 1942. It marked America's first use of ground troops in a major offensive against the Japanese Empire. Tregaskis' dedications to his job during his time on Guadalcanal had impressed the Marines' commander, General Alexander Vandegrift. The general recalled that Tregaskis seemed to be everywhere, and the information that he acquired was factual and not a canned handout. Vandegrift especially remembered that during the height of the fighting for what came to be known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge, he could hear through the darkness the sound of a typewriter clacking away. I asked who could be writing at this time when he could not possibly see the paper, the general remembered. Dick spoke up. "It's me, General. I want to get this down while I'm still able. Don't worry about me seeing. I'm using the touch system." On November 6, Barry Ferris, INS Editor-in-Chief, wrote Tregaskis that his manuscript, with information so secret that military censors in the U.S. Navy offices at Pearl Harbor had locked away the reporter's notebooks and his big black diary every night after he had finished working on his manuscript during the day, had finally arrived. Ferris turned the pages over to Ward Green, who was executive editor of King Features, owned and operated, as was the INS, by newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst. Ferris wrote that Green would make every attempt to get Tregaskis' book accepted by a publisher and also serialized in national magazines. "I did not have a chance to read it thoroughly as I would have liked," Ferris wrote Tregaskis, but he informed him that he would be splitting the revenue 50-50 with his employer. "But from what I did see, I think that you did do a magnificent job on it." One person who did take the time to read Tregaskis' writings from beginning to end was Bennett Cerf, co-founder of the Random House publishing firm. Green had distributed copies of the manuscript to 9 publishers and asked them to bid on the rights to publish the book, a method that had never been done before. Cerf noted, just the day before he received the work, Cerf had been talking with his colleagues that the first book that came out about what was going on at Guadalcanal would be a knockout because Guadalcanal marked the turning point of the tide in the war in the Pacific, which at that time had been going very badly for American forces. As the publisher noted, the dictators were ready and the liberty-loving people were caught unprepared. Cerf received the manuscript from King Features on November 11th, took it home with him, read it that night all the way through, and called Green at 9 o'clock the next morning, telling him, "I've got to have this book." A pleased Cerf related years later that Random House had signed up to publish the young reporter's work even before any of the 8 other publishers who had received the manuscript had had a time to read it over. His premonition that the American public would be interested in learning more about the Marines and their pitched battles with an enemy on a remote island thousands of miles away turned out to be highly accurate. Rushed into print on January 18, 1943, Guadalcanal Diary became a bestseller and also became the first Random House book to sell more than 100,000 copies. Critic John Chamberlain of the New York Times wrote that Tregaskis' book served as a tonic for the war-weary then on the home front, showing as it did to the Japanese and those who doubted America's resolve that a country doesn't necessarily have to love war in order to fight one. Although an unknown in the publishing world, Tregaskis had already made a name for himself with his employer at INS and also other correspondents who had followed America's forces into battle during those early desperate days of fighting in the Pacific Theater. Before he had landed with the Marines on Guadalcanal, Dick had been on the scene and written dispatches for INS member newspapers about some of the main turning points in the war, especially for the American Navy, including watching from a nearby cruiser as Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led his forces of Army B-25 bombers off the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet to bomb Tokyo on April 18, 1942. After the Doolittle raid, Tregaskis had boarded the Hornet and remained with the carrier's officers and enlisted men as they attempted but missed out on joining other American carriers at the Battle of Coral Sea in early May 1942. He remained on the Hornet for his next foray into the Pacific and saw the carrier's crews take off from its wooden flight deck to seek further revenge for Pearl Harbor against Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway, which was a smashing victory for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In his daily interactions with the ship's crew during operations and also under fire, he learned more about their attitudes about the war and death, which he discovered were very sane and matter of fact, as each man might have his life ended any day at sea, either by the enemy's doing or just by accident. I'd seen some of our flyers virtually drunk with excitement immediately after their first experience in the maelstrom of actual combat, Tregaskis recalled. But I was to find that such oft-repeated matters as being locked below decks while there was action above, or sailing through waters thick with submarines, or witnessing accidents, or losing one's best friend in battle, became routine when repeated often enough. After Midway, in which action several pilots had been killed, including every member of Torpedo Squadron 8 except for one man, Ensign George Gay, Tregaskis had been startled when gathered for dinner that nobody mentioned the empty chairs who were gathered around the table. Instead, the conversation revolved around the usual unimportant matters. But when I reflected on the matter, I could see that silence was the most sensible approach. Covering the Doolittle raid and Midway represented an impressive achievement for an inexperienced war correspondent hired by the INS shortly before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Tregaskis had also just learned from his doctor that he suffered from diabetes, which ran in his family, and had been turned down for service in the war. Working on the late shift on the rewrite desk at INS's New York offices, he had grown so despondent about his failed contribution, which he saw to the war effort, that he even contemplated taking his own life. He rallied, however, and excitedly took to his assignment as an INS war correspondent who was supposed to cover the Pacific Fleet operations. After all, he reflected, the closer he came to getting killed in his career, the better my story would be, that is, if I survived. Born on November 28, 1916, in Elizabeth, New Jersey, Tregaskis was the second child and first son of Archibald and Maud Osterman Tregaskis. Maud, whose family came from Germany and included a long line of scholars and teachers, said that her children were both excellent students and stood at the head of their class each month with very few exceptions. Archibald, who was originally from England, made his living as the head of the editorial department for the Singer Manufacturing Company, which of course produced Singer sewing machines in a factory on the city's outskirts. As a boy, the young Tregaskis had been a keen reader, drawn, he remembered, to many warlike sagas of the past, including the adventures of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and Spain's legendary El Cid, and Scandinavian hero Beowulf. All of these characters, Tregaskis noted, were brave men at war for ideals in the past. As a schoolboy, always bigger than others of my age, I had resented and done battle with the bullies who picked on smaller boys. His interest in journalism started early, at the age of 15. He attended 2 private institutions in the area and helped his parents, who were strapped for cash because of the economic downturn of the Great Depression, and Archibald's poor health because of his own battles with diabetes, by paying through his education through winning academic scholarships, working as a student waiter, and writing short articles about school activities for newspapers in New York City, Newark and Trenton, New Jersey, and also Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He got more of his articles into print, thereby earning some extra money by using a variety of aliases for his articles, including one that he really enjoyed called Copyright. Receiving scholarships from such groups as the Harvard Club of New Jersey, he was able to accept admission to the freshman class at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1934. He studied English literature, history, government, and also economics. With an eye toward a career in journalism, Tregaskis believed that possessing a broad sweep of information was important to a writer, more so than in any other profession, he believed. A nonfiction writer, especially, he noted, should know something about almost every subject because his article assignments may carry him into highly specialized fields. And without a basic knowledge, he is apt to be sorely handicapped in doing his research. After graduating from Harvard in June 1938, Tregaskis got a job as a feature writer for the Boston Advertiser newspaper. His schedule at the Advertiser included 4 days of writing feature articles and also a double day of news reporting and doing rewrite on other reporters' articles. I covered all the beats, including the waterfront, the State House, the Federal Building, police headquarters, and also the courthouse, he recalled. In early 1941, Tregaskis earned a job with the International News Service. Now, this was not America's journalism's preferred wire service. It ran a poor third to the top 2, the Associated Press and United Press. And although scorned and often bad-mouthed by both of their rivals, one longtime INS reporter and syndicated columnist Bob Considine said that they were some of the proudest people in the news business. They were proud, he said, despite being outmanned by the other wire services when they were covering the same story. Tregaskis was ready, willing, and able when called upon by his bosses at INS for service overseas in the Pacific. Standing approximately 6 feet 5 inches in height, Tregaskis had been warned by many friends before going into action that the Japanese, if they did not kill him, would capture him and use him as an observation post. But he left Guadalcanal relatively unscathed, except for bouts with malaria and some gastric difficulties. He considered himself an unlikely type to be a war correspondent because of his tall stature, his thin frame, and poor eyesight. But he said that he risked his life in war out of a double sense of duty to his country and to the men who were fighting on its behalf. He was also driven by an insatiable curiosity to uncover the stories of those who had actually been in combat themselves. His willingness to go where the action was impressed everyone, including one soldier who said to him, "How you guys go and stick your necks out when you don't have to? Well, it just beats the hell out of me." Tregaskis had a simple answer, but we certainly have to. That's our job. Tregaskis' luck ran out when he was accompanying Allied forces during the invasion of Italy. On November 22, 1943, after observing U.S. Rangers battling Germans on Mount Corno near Cassino, Italy, Tregaskis was returning to headquarters to write his story when a German shell landed near him. Shrapnel struck and pierced his helmet, lodging in his brain and causing partial paralysis, also robbing him for a short time of his power to speak, read, and write. They carried me out with a hole in my skull the size of a soup spoon and bone and steel fragments embedded 2 inches deep in my brain, he recalled. He worked his way back in the United States through 6 Army and Navy hospitals, and finally, at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., doctors put a metal plate made of tantalum into the skull, after which he went right back to the fighting front. Before doing so, Tregaskis, who received a Purple Heart from the military for his injuries, produced a second book, this one called Invasion Diary. It detailed his time covering the invasions of Sicily and Italy, his near-death experiences on Mount Corno, and his torturous recovery from his wounding. Throughout all of these difficulties, he tried to keep his sense of humor. When one of his friends visited him at Walter Reed, Tregaskis asked him to do a favor. "Sure, anything," the friend responded. "Well," said Tregaskis, "before they put the metal plate on, take a look inside my head and see if my brain is still there." The friend obliged and confirmed that his friend's brain remained where it should be. "Fine," said a relieved Tregaskis. "I might have to use it someday." He also joked with the doctors performing the operation, asking them if the metal they were putting into his head was bulletproof. Unfortunately, it was not. A recovered Tregaskis caught up with American forces in the summer of 1944 after their successful breakout from the Normandy beachhead. He did notice, however, a change in his attitude about being in combat after almost losing his own life. "I was aware of a new and dreadful sensitivity to the dangers of war, an acute nervous state that made the sounds of incoming shells or enemy machine gun fire crushing and unbearable," he said. His nerves continued to be shaky as he made his way across France, Belgium, Holland, and into Nazi Germany itself. He decided to put himself to the ultimate test by participating in the battle to take the German city of Aachen alongside a frontline unit with the Big Red One, the 1st Division. If he survived, he thought he'd be equipped with a new set of nerves and possibly a good story as well. He immersed himself into a perilous form of warfare, street fighting, a task that Tregaskis described in an article for the Saturday Evening Post as the bitter, exasperating, block by block and house by house struggle which develops when war sweeps through thickly settled communities and the enemy is determined to make a fight of it. Tregaskis could not get what he saw at Aachen out of his mind after going back to the United States for a rest. He was seized with what he called a fever to write something about that battle, and in a couple of months of frenzied work, produced a novel, his first fiction book, titled Stronger Than Fear, which he dedicated to the valor of the infantry, the soldiers without armor who are in the vanguard of every attack. The book details the experiences of a captain named Paul Kreider, who fought his own battle with fear during intense fighting in a city that Tregaskis named Unterbach, which is kind of a stand-in for Aachen. The writing of the book was a hard struggle, he admitted, but when it was over, I felt I had distilled a central truth of life at war, and perhaps even of life in general. The truth that is that when you are faced with a mortal fear, which demands the deepest kind of courage, and you can find that courage, you have won life's most important battle, the battle for self-respect. Tregaskis could remain safe on the home front. However, when editors of a national magazine asked him to return to the Pacific to follow the crew of a B-29 bomber as they prepared for bombing mission against the Japanese Hon Islands, he accepted. He was even asked by one of the magazine's editors, "Do you really want to go?" And without hesitating, he gave the answer that any reporter who covered World War II would understand. "I don't want to go, but I think I ought to go." So he went. Tregaskis was one of the approximately 1,800 men and women who worked as combat reporters, a job that Tregaskis once described as an outsider with special privileges during World War II. He never in his career as a correspondent sent home a rewrite of a headquarters communique, said one of his INS colleagues. Tregaskis did not believe in communiques. He had to go out there and see for himself. He knew from personal experience which of his colleagues would not be content with merely taking information from military headquarters safe behind the lines. To make their dispatches as accurate as they possibly could be, they would make the fatiguing journeys, he pointed out, up to the various division headquarters, even the progressively smaller units, to regiments and battalions and even companies, each stop growing increasingly dangerous, yet more productive of the real facts as the distance from the enemy diminished. Dedicated reporters such as Don Whitehead of the Associated Press and Russell Hill of the New York Tribune had the courage to go up and get the material, Tregaskis said, as well as having the guts to write about what they uncovered honestly, even with a constant demand from their editors back home for sensational headlines from the front lines. The best correspondent, he said, stuck to the facts even when it hurt, when a less principled rival might twist the story into a fake to make it a better story. Tregaskis had often pondered why he and others risked their lives in the war. Good correspondents, he said, like other people of action, were generally unwilling to make themselves heroes, but most will admit that they take chances in war zones for the same reasons the mountain climber gave when asked why he wanted to scale Mount Everest, because it is there. Although AP reporter Hal Boyle once joked that all one needed to be a war correspondent was a strong stomach, a weak mind, and plenty of endurance, Tregaskis and his colleagues were well aware of the dangers that they faced. Despite the death and disabilities that went hand in hand with war, Tregaskis said there was another facet that drew people, whatever their personal persuasion or sex: the instant elimination of personal ambition in favor of unselfish dedication to a greater cause. Never mind that the fact that the cause is the destruction of an enemy and the expenditure of resources, including life and health, to destroy something the foe considers highly valuable. Still, he acknowledged, war can be as exciting as anything in life. After the war ended, Tregaskis returned home, worked as a time for a screenwriter for Hollywood films and television programs, as well as serving as a roving worldwide reporter for True magazine. He finally settled in Hawaii and found happiness at last with his third wife, Moana, who often accompanied him on his travels, serving as his photographer. The lure of action tempted him once again, and he spent considerable time in South Vietnam in the early 1960s, interacting with American advisors for the South Vietnamese Army in the field, and producing another well-regarded book about combat, this one called Vietnam Diary. Before he died at age 56 from a heart attack while swimming in the Pacific Ocean on August 15, 1973, he had returned to the island that had made him famous, Guadalcanal. Roaming the battle sites once again on the island, he saw that the jungle always appeared to be the same. Any swipe at the tangled green mass unearthed rusting war machinery, everything from airline parts to spent ammunition, as well as the ghastly remnants of those who had fought there, including bleached white skulls. To Tregaskis, it did not matter if the jungle continued to engulf the foxholes and shells and rusting guns and tanks. It doesn't matter if the jungle looks as savagely pristine as it did before, just so long as the same vigor and guts and bottomless springs of ingenuity, devotion, and humor continue to characterize our fighting men. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about Richard Tregaskis and his experiences in combat in the Pacific and in Europe during World War II.